Hello, historians, and welcome back. Today's lesson is called Meanwhile in Spain, the Spaniards. I am your usual host and your lecture professor, Dr. Summer Sherland. I titled this lecture Meanwhile in Spain because when Spanish arrival occurred in the New World, it didn't come out of nowhere, right? And just as the Spanish were experiencing things on the Iberian Peninsula, the native people living in Mesoamerica were experiencing things, and these were occurring at the same time, and then the worlds collided. If you had taken this class 20 years ago or with a different instructor, you might have started your survey of Mexican American history and culture with Spanish influences, right? With Spanish culture, Spanish history, what was happening in Europe. But that's kind of an outdated mode. And there will be a couple of things we talk about today that I will reference when it comes to that outdated mode, because a lot of times people used to assume that what was happening in Europe was the old kind of ancient established history. And what was happening in the Americas was kind of the new raw virgin history. And that when the Europeans arrived in the Americas, they brought with them old world behaviors and diseases and activities and cultural patterns. And they introduced all of these things to sort of new, untouched, uncultured people. But as we've discovered recently in this class, there was a vibrant history and culture occurring in Mesoamerica, modern day Mexico, and the modern day Southwest, that was occurring at the exact same time as Roman evolution, Greek conquest of the European continent, and eventually what we'll learn about today, the evolution of the Iberian Peninsula. So in my talk today, I want you to be looking for a couple of things. The first is I want you to be looking for kind of old world factors that are in contrast to our new world factors, which we've already talked about in this class. I put those terms in quotes because really these are outdated concepts. The idea that Europe is old and America is new. That's not really the way we in the 21st century as historians refer to these aspects of history anymore. But I put them in quotes because people living at the time saw it that way. Contextually and within our content, they referred to Europe as the old world and to the Americas as the new world. And so I want you to be thinking as a historian, what are some elements that seem ancient and old and distinctive to Europe that are in contrast to some of the things that you know about Mesoamerica? Another thing I want you to be looking for is this date, 1492. Now, some of you are probably too young to know this poem, but a lot of you might know it. A lot of school children are taught at a very young age this little limerick that goes, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And it's a reminder that that's the year that Columbus arrived in the New World, right? And Columbus, of course, was commissioned by Spain. Well, I'm not going to talk about Columbus at all today, and I rarely talk about Columbus in this class, but that date, 1492, will appear in this lecture several times, and it has nothing to do with Columbus. And so I want that to be a trigger, and really anything in the late 1400s, early 1500s, I want you to be thinking like, what's happening in Spain at this time, right? What's occurring around the years of Columbus's discovery of America or of Spanish arrival and conquest? What's happening like just before and just after? Because as historians, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for this thing called context, where we're trying to place one person's story in the context of a greater global trajectory. So I'd like you to look for the year 1492, but also really anything at the turn of the century. And when I say turn of the century, I mean kind of as the 15th century or 1400s transitions into the 16th century or 1500s. And it's a little confusing if you don't already know that's how it works, but when you say like we're in the 21st century, right? That's kind of where we are. We're in the 2000s. So the third thing to look for is similar to the first thing. I want you to be looking for things that are occurring in Spain or up until it becomes Spain, it's the Iberian Peninsula. Look for like social, economic, and political influences that might be informing Spain's arrival and subsequent conquest of the Americas. What is motivating Spain to send people to what they called the New World? What's motivating Spaniards to go and conquer territories and secure riches, and in many cases, establish kind of violent patterns in the Americas? What's motivating them to send Franciscan and Jesuit friars to kind of conquer the New World in the name of Catholicism? So I'm asking for you to look for those things, like the differences between the New World and the Old World, what's happening at the turn of the 15th century, and what are some social, economic, and political influences that are occurring in Spain that are going to impact what we know about modern day Mexico. Okay? And remember, the thesis of this class, this whole class, is about one thing: Mexican-American history and culture. So aren't you wondering, like, what led to the evolution of Mexican-American history and culture as we know it now? So far, we've only covered Mesoamerican, like in some cases ancient, but in many cases native organizations and sort of political and civilization patterns, right? But we haven't explored anything pertaining to the Spanish language or Catholicism or Spanish influenced art, right? Those kinds of things impact the cultures of the New World and ultimately help create a completely new culture that we know now of as Mexican-American culture. All right, so we're going to begin with the Iberian Peninsula. What is the Iberian Peninsula? What am I talking about? You'll hear that word Iberia throughout today's lecture. You'll read it in some of the things that you're learning with. You'll hear about it probably for the next several weeks. So this is the Iberian Peninsula. You can see the map on my screen as we know it today. It essentially encompasses Spain and Portugal, as well as a couple other regions as well. It is at the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea. It's the southwest, kind of the southwest corner of Europe. It's the southern tip of Europe's entire continent, and it touches to Africa. You can see Morocco at the bottom right of the screen. For a long time, the Iberian Peninsula was treated as like this unique, special, exceptional place that was distinct from the rest of Europe in terms of its political, economic, and societal patterns. But actually, more recently, historians have begun to see the Iberian Peninsula as part of kind of a greater global story. So again, it's a little outdated to think that like Iberian history is so special and so unique. There are elements of it that are unique and special, but it's part of a larger story that's being told in terms of global history. One thing that is unique about the Iberian Peninsula is that prior to the 700s, it was dominated by a Muslim caliphate. So it was dominated not by Anglo-Saxons or white people, right? It was dominated mostly by the influences of sort of Muslim migration patterns from Morocco and beyond. Okay, we're not going to start really with like the beginning of humankind on the Iberian Peninsula, because again, we're not really looking at Iberian or Spanish history for this class. We're trying to understand the evolution of Mexican-American history and culture. So we can jump ahead a little bit to kind of the framework of Iberian culture as it eventually informs Spanish arrival in the Americas. So if you see up here, and I'll annotate for you so that you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Up here in modern day France, there were a group of people that pushed into the Islamic territory of the Caliphate in the 770s. And this was after over a millennium of invasion and settlement by people into the Iberian Peninsula. So the peninsula was never like a isolated pastoral place where nobody, bothered it. It started with kind of white people pushing into Muslim territory. You can see that there were quite a few different cultures that contributed to the economy and societal realities of the Iberian Peninsula, including Phoenicians, Celts, Greeks, Romans, Visigoths, and Muslims. But no group was more significant in terms of establishing a permanent culture than the Romans. The Romans actually colonized the Iberian Peninsula for 600 years, 6 centuries. And you can see that through number one thing, and that is language. So Spanish is a direct descendant of the Latin language, and Romans spoke Latin. So there was a Muslim invasion in 711, but it didn't really change permanently the linguistic patterns nor the religious patterns of the Iberian Peninsula as established under Roman rule. So you can start to see also kind of in that same area in the northwestern region. So you have the north where folks came in from modern day France, and all along really the northern coast, you have competition among Catholics and Muslims that lasted for centuries. And then meanwhile, you have the evolution of the Kingdom of Portugal, which today looks a little different than this map. This is an older map. So Portugal develops as a result of a rebellion of peasants against feudal or sort of land ownership overlords. And that happens in 1140. Initially, it consisted of the entire northern half of what is the contemporary state of Portugal, and then eventually extended its borders into this area that's kind of darkened, and that's Muslim-controlled territory. And now Portugal takes up the majority of the western coast of the Iberian Peninsula. But by the end of the 13th century, there were three powerful kingdoms: Castile, which you see here in pink, Aragon, which you see here in green, and Portugal, which you see here in blue. So Galicia, Leon, Navarra, and Catalan, they all are significant, but over the course of time, these three, Aragon, Castile, and Portugal, really consolidate power. So what's going on in each of these places? You can read through this slide if you want to know like the differences between what's happening in the Castile versus what's happening in Aragon and Catalan society, Portugal, right? You can learn about a couple of these things, but something I wanted to point out on this slide is that during the 15th century, so remember that's the 1400s, many problems throughout the Iberian Peninsula resulted from the Black Death. The Black Death was the 15th century plague in Europe, and it essentially just killed off generations of people. So essentially it depleted the labor force because the people who died in large droves tended to be people who were laborers or workers. There were a couple other things that happened. There were some peasant uprisings during the time in the late 1400s, early 1500s. There was lots of popular unrest, conflict throughout all of Europe, resulting from economic burdens as well as religious persecution. We'll talk more about persecution in the coming slides. So in the 15th centuries and 16th centuries, there is a rise of a totally new Iberian force. Remember, there were those three kingdoms that dominated the peninsula. You had Portugal, you had Castile, and you had Aragon, right? So Ferdinand of Aragon, who's a royal prince, and Isabel of Castile get married. And from 1479 to 1504, these monarchs essentially pursued a coordination policy of foreign and domestic affairs. So they become this consolidated power of Aragon and Castile. And they both seek essentially world domination, right? And they establish this through all sorts of things, through financial efforts, political efforts, and eventually discovery efforts. This broadened the powers of, they were both Catholic, so this broadened the powers of Catholicism as well as the powers of the monarchy. In 1492, Spanish forces, which is the combination of these two kingdoms, conquered Granada. Granada is a city in Spain. Meanwhile, they also annexed a territory of Spain in the Iberian Peninsula. And what they ultimately did this way was they cut off any French control or French influence in the Iberian Peninsula. Because France is happening up here, right? Just like north of Spain, modern day Spain, and they're trying to influence and control territories as well. Spain also conquered parts of Italy, and they used Italy as a strategic military and political outpost. And then by 1550, Spain's holdings were enormous. You can see on the slide that Spain controlled the following territories: what they called the Low Countries, Austria, Hungary, most of Italy, Portugal, Habsburg, and essentially they controlled all of the Iberian Peninsula. Meanwhile, they had their eyes on another territory. In the late 1400s, early 1500s, they set their sights on the Americas, in part because they believed the Americas had a wealth of empty, unsettled land, and a ton of natural resources like gold, silver, bronze, but also lumber, right? Coal, all different kinds of resources that were unique to America. You can read through this. Spain went through a series of economic ups and downs, in part because of something that was happening politically and socially at the time. They were also spending a ton of money on American exploration. So sending people to different parts of the Americas and establishing empires, that is not cheap, right? Those are not cheap enterprises. It's the same thing as trying to fund sending someone to the moon to, or to colonize parts of Mars. It's not, no one can just, you can't just do it, right? You have to be a king or a monarch or a very wealthy, independently wealthy businessman. So Spain eventually goes bankrupt and they have a conflict throughout the 17th century. Now remember, Spanish arrival in the Americas occurs in the early 1500s, late 1400s. The 17th century is the 1600s, and Spain is already in economic decline. So it's only over the course of like 100 years that Spain goes from being incredibly powerful and wealthy to really struggling financially. We'll explore that a little bit more as the semester goes on. Spain, right? Remember, it originated as a Muslim caliphate. It originated as Muslim territory. And some of the people that lived in modern day Spain called themselves Moors. These were African people typically. So Spain is made up of a variety of people. It has a very unique composition when it comes to their demographic, especially in the 15th and 16th centuries. You have very white people who migrated from modern day France. You have Moors, people who are Moorish, or they call themselves Moors, and they tend to be African, they're dark skinned. You have people who have lived as a combination of all of these races who've lived on the Iberian Peninsula for generations. There was, as a result, a vibrant social character existing in modern day Spain and Spain at the time. One of the number one ways that Spaniards kind of experienced social and cultural kind of entertainment is through theater. And what's cool about theater in Spain is that it was accessible to both elites and the working class. The theater was considered like form of comedy, but satire. So satire is like a sarcastic comedy, and comedy not in the dramatic sense of balance, but comedy in the sense of humor, right? So in many ways, their theater ridiculed the aristocracy and the monarchy, and it really sort of like placed typically subordinate people in kind of a place of control or power. They also had other ways of kind of exploring their cultural patterns, including the Saints' Day feasts, festivals, pageants, etc., and a variety of ways to have leisure. So in a lot of ways, Spanish culture was vibrant and alive and enjoyable. It wasn't the kind of place where people were fleeing the way they might have been in parts of Great Britain. So there was a golden age in Spain, and that would have been, remember how I said like European contact happens around the late 1400s, and then Spain kind of declines around the like 1700s. So this era between those two things tends to be kind of the golden age of Spain. But it's golden for Spanish Iberian people, just like I mentioned kind of the theater and like the fun that existed in Spain. That existed for Iberian people, not necessarily anyone who was seen as other or outside. So here's what's problematic. On the Iberian Peninsula, Christians, Muslims, and Jews had coexisted for most of the period of Islamic rule. But when Queen Isabella took control over those two, when they took control over those two territories, she secured authorization as a state, right? So rather than have these like kingdoms that kind of existed independently, she consolidated power. And she basically launched the Inquisition in 1476. The very first people to be targeted were Jews, or they were also called conversos. Over the course of the next 300 years, the Inquisition brought about the execution of 3,000 persons, anybody who was suspected of what was called religious heresy. Heresy would be kind of speaking out against the Inquisition, speaking out against the Bible, blasphemy, anything that could be deemed as kind of anti-Catholic. In 1492, the persecution intensified when the Jewish population was ordered en masse by the crown, by the queen, to convert to Catholicism or leave Spain. About 50,000 became conversos, converted from Judaism, to Catholicism, while about 100,000 people left. Only a few short years later, the Catholic kings issued a similar order regarding anyone who was Muslim living in Castile in particular. Muslim peasants fled or converted to Christianity. Instead of being called conversos, they were called moriscos. Essentially, the Spanish crown, the Kingdom of Spain, and the royalty who held the authority of Spain wanted to become nationwide and globally known as the defender of the Catholic faith. Now, there were other Catholic countries throughout Europe during this time, a little bit before and a little bit after. France was relatively Catholic, parts of the Netherlands, and until a very dramatic turn of events, Great Britain. So there's also this period of time called the Reconquista, and it was a 7-century-long process of reconquista, right, of much of Iberia from Muslims who first invaded the region. So this you should be beginning to see the conflict between Catholic and Muslim people, and it lasted from the early 700s all the way to 1492. Expansion of Christianity defined the Reconquista, as well as conflicts among Muslim people and Christians. But what's interesting is that it's not cut and dry. It's not like 700 years of conflict between these two groups. In fact, there are numerous instances and examples of alliances that were formed among Christian people and Muslim people. It ended in 1492 when Spain conquered Granada. This was the last Muslim state in the southern part of Iberia, and Granada was a town that was controlled mostly by Muslims. They were also calling the Reconquista a crusade to liberate formerly Christian lands from the hands of infidels. That's what they called people who were not Christian. And the nobility, the people who were royal, essentially benefited more than anybody else. Queen Isabella called herself the Catholic and essentially ordered the expulsion of all Jewish people who refused to become conversos, so people who did not convert to Christianity. It essentially caused significant hostility towards Jews throughout the 14th and 15th century. I mentioned the beautiful city of Granada. Granada is very unique. If you were to look at the architecture of Spain, modern day Spain and Portugal, and then compare it to the city of Granada, which is in Spain, it would be really interesting, right? Like maybe do a Google Drive or Google search of images for these kind of different examples of architecture and art, because Granada is very unique. It is in southern Spain at the confluence of two major rivers. It was once a Moorish, so remember that word Moor, M-O-O-R. It was once a Moorish fortress that rose to prominence during the 11th century. In 1238, the Reconquista forced Spanish Muslims south, and the Kingdom of Granada was established as the last refuge of the Moors. So about 1238 is when the Moors took over Granada and tried to make that their final anchor. But then in the late 15th century, the Spanish monarchy under Ferdinand and Isabella essentially conquered Granada. It was surrendered in 1492 to the Spanish, and in 1502, the Spanish crown forcibly removed all Muslims or converted them to Christianity. You can read a lot about the Roman Catholic Church. It plays a significant role in the establishment of Spanish colonies in the New World, but essentially Iberian Catholicism, so Catholicism as it was established on the Iberian Peninsula of Spain, etc., was very chauvinistic, it was exclusive, and it was militant. It was not progressive, it was not welcoming, it was not kind of open, come one, come all. It did have strong threads of mysticism and a devotion to the Virgin Mary, and it championed the Catholic Church championed the idea of Immaculate Conception, which held that Mary was not only the mother of Jesus, but also born of original sin, or free of original sin. Finally, the reform of the church, and particularly of the monastic orders in the late 15th century, created a pool of missionaries. And these missionaries were men primarily who were sent to America to Christianize what they called savages. So under this idea of Christianity, of Catholicism, missionaries were trained and ordained to move to America and colonize and Christianize Native people. The Roman Catholic Church brought with it what was called a crusader mentality. Now I want you to be thinking about that. Remember, old world, right? How does it manifest in the new world? This crusader mentality departed of Spain and arrived in the New World with this idea that it was God's will and God's order that these Native people in America be converted to this form of Christianity. And following this, any encounters in the New World after 1492, the papacy theoretically assumed responsibility for the organization of all missions in the New World and all Native people. So the Roman Catholic Church, as early as about 1508, assumed all control of all Native people living in the Americas. So how does this manifest in the New World? So you've got the old world version of Catholicism and the beliefs that kind of are ordained or central. What does it look like in Mexico and the Southwest as we define those regions today? Well, I'll tell you, the first Catholic settlement that was established was mostly unfruitful. It mostly didn't go very well. And then later, the most successful original Spanish or Catholic outpost was French. So the French actually set up an establishment for Catholic conversion in Jacksonville. Yeah, that's right. So in Jacksonville, Florida. So what the Spanish did was, instead of being like, oh, yay, Catholicism is here in the New World, they attacked the French outpost and declared their own control over pretty much all of Florida. And they began sending Spanish priests to establish what they called Indian missions. So the first Native American Catholic mission was founded by a Catholic priest from about 1566 to about 1572. The goal of the priest, his name was Montero, was to spread Catholicism to Native American groups, and this was a critical mission for the first Spanish settlers. There are kind of two groups of Spanish settlers. You have the priests, whose job it is to indoctrinate Native people through what they called missions, and missions aren't just like efforts or trips. Missions are cities, right, or little ranches. So there's the religious side, and the other side is sort of like the pillage and plunder, right? The conquerors, the ones who come in, steal all of the mineral wealth or any kind of physical wealth, and in many ways injure or violently assault the Native people living there. Those are sort of your two approaches of Spanish conquest. The first people to arrive as Spanish missionaries, as Catholic kind of Catholic, what am I trying to say? Catholic sort of missionaries on behalf of the Spanish crown were Jesuit. So they were chosen early to missionize Native American groups living in and around Florida, but they were relatively unsuccessful because Native people were not interested. They didn't want to be Christianized. They didn't want to be indoctrinated with the Catholic beliefs, and they had their own spiritual guidelines. So essentially, by 1595, Spain began sending Franciscan priests instead of Jesuit priests. So Franciscan priests arrived about, 50 years later or so, and they replaced the unsuccessful Jesuits. They also established missions throughout Florida and later up and down Texas, New Mexico, and what they called Alta California. Two things I wanted to point out about Spanish behaviors in the New World. The first is called the Colombian Exchange. Now, you might think the word Colombian refers to the country Colombia, but it refers to Columbus, right? The Colombian Exchange refers to the arrival of Columbus, right? So here's what happens. When Europeans arrive in the Americas, they bring with them all kinds of things. And if you look on this map below on the bottom left, you can see a couple examples of European goods that they bring to the Americas from Africa and Asia. They bring citrus fruit, they bring grapes, bananas, sugarcane, honeybee, peaches, pears, coffee beans, turnips, olives, and onion. You know what else they bring with them? People and diseases. They also bring things like cattle and horses. So then what happens is they arrive in the New World with all of these goods, right? And people and items and diseases. And they exchange or trade or send back to the old world all of these things that were indigenous to America, including squash and tobacco, pumpkin, turkeys, potatoes, sweet potatoes, avocado, peppers, pineapple, cocoa beans, peanuts, potatoes, beans, vanilla, tomato, corn, and also people. So this is called the Colombian Exchange, the exchange of goods and people, as well as illnesses across the Atlantic Ocean, with the arrival of Europeans and African slaves. The other thing they bring with them is a uniquely Spanish tradition, right? A Spanish culture. And that blends with the uniquely Mesoamerican culture to form a completely new culture in the New World. So they're influenced by Spanish customs and traditions on the Iberian Peninsula, but then African and local native customs, essentially what this word is called Latinized, America as kind of a diverse new culture at the time. So there were all these unique new traditions and unique new cultural patterns. One of my favorite examples is if you were to look at like Mexican, and before it was called Mexican, right? But like sort of New Spain art, you'll notice that a lot of it's religious in form. A lot of it is Catholic in terms of kind of the emphasis that it's placing, but the skin of the people that are painted is a little bit darker than maybe what would be painted in the Iberian Peninsula. That's because skin tones were different in the Americas than they were on the Iberian Peninsula. So I've told you about the religious conquest of the Americas, or at least the attempt. But what about that violent conquest of the Americas? In 1519, Hernan Cortez arrives in Mexico City, what was called Tenochtitlan. It was ruled by Moctezuma II, and there were about 200 to 300,000 residents. When Cortez arrived, he and the men he arrived with called it the greatest city they had ever seen. And these are people who came from Spain, right? That had all these huge cities that were really, really impressive, and castles and things like that. So you have to remember that parts of Mexico City and Mesoamerica were just as impressive as anywhere else in the world at the time. Here's what's interesting about Cortez. And you can spell it with a Z or an S. Cortez was initially stationed as a soldier in Cuba, but he decided he wanted to pursue glory, and he wanted to claim land and wealth on behalf of the Spanish crown. So he actually organized a clandestine secret crew and an unauthorized exploration into Mesoamerica. He didn't get to Tenochtitlan right away. Instead, he arrived on the Yucatan, where he encountered indigenous people who told him all about other Europeans who had been there before. They had been shipwrecked and captured by local Mayans. Well, Cortez found them, and he essentially helped to free a Franciscan friar named Aguilar. And he helped kind of negotiate the Mayans' release of Aguilar. And what happens is then Aguilar teaches him how to speak a local language, Chantal, which is Mayan. So now Aguilar knows how to speak the local language, and Cortez knows a little bit about it as well. And they begin traveling the region, and they're not very friendly to the indigenous people. Later, an Aztec chief gives them 20 young women as slaves. One of those women is named Malinali. She is Nuaa, and she is a woman of the Mexican Gulf Coast. You might know her as Doña Marina or La Malinche. So together with La Malinche, okay, so La Malinche's story is really significant. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but She had 3 different languages she could speak, and she could speak Nahuatl, which was the Aztec language. So together with La Malinche and Aguilar, Cortez now has the ability to speak to the Mayans and speak to the Aztecs. So they're originally welcomed in Tenochtitlan by Moctezuma II. They're welcomed, they're greeted, they're given gifts, things like that. And in turn, Cortez arrests Moctezuma, places him under house arrest or imprisonment, and attempts to essentially kind of rule Tenochtitlan through Moctezuma's kind of likeness. Well, he is stalled when the Cuban government decides that they're going to arrest Cortez for launching an unauthorized trip into Mexico City. So he leaves his lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, in charge of Tenochtitlan, and Cortez goes back to the coast to essentially meet the troops from Cuba, and he defeats them. While he's gone, Alvarado essentially rebels and has hundreds of Aztec nobles killed during a ceremonial feast, which leads to unrest throughout all of Tenochtitlan. So Tenochtitlan demands these Spaniards be removed from the city, and they realize that Moctezuma is being held captive. So what happens is that the Spaniards either killed Moctezuma II or they allowed him to be killed in a battle. The records are relatively unclear. Most of the written language or written records we have are from Spanish sources. So it's a little unsure as to how Moctezuma was killed, but he was essentially killed by Spanish efforts, either by Spanish swords or because he was let to die. Essentially, the Spaniards were pushed back from the city, but they returned and swiftly took down all of the remaining Aztecs. One thing this account leaves out is the significance of European diseases. Remember when I told you through the Colombian Exchange, kind of old world things, including people and diseases, came over as well as crops, and new world crops go over to the other side of the Atlantic? Well, before Cortez even arrived in Mesoamerica on the Mayan coast, Spanish diseases like smallpox, like the plague, those kinds of things, those are little viruses, as you probably know. Those bacteria get spread through human and animal contact. And so even before the Spaniards even arrived in Mesoamerica, their diseases had made it to indigenous people who were not inoculated or vaccinated, nor had they any antibodies against these foreign diseases. So even though the Spaniards conquered the Aztec people with like a violent takedown, many of the Aztec people had already succumbed to European diseases, which were new to them because they had no antibodies to protect them. So that's it. That's today's lesson on Meanwhile in Spain. What's happening in Spain? And so in reflection, I want you to think about these 3 questions. 1, what old world factors unique to the Iberian Peninsula from as early as 700 AD contributed to Spanish conquest of the Americas? 2, what occurred at the end of the 1400s that contributed to the Spanish conquest of the Americas? What motivated Spain to begin conquering territories in the 1400s? And 3, what social, economic, and political influences existed in Spain that may have influenced Spanish behaviors in the Americas? All right, that's it for today. I'd like you to reflect on these 3 questions, and I can't wait to hear what you think.